Someone once wrote that you can never see God because God is not an object, God is a subject. Can you comment on that?
You can't see God because when you are God, there's nothing to see. You're not God in an absolute sense, but you're so much God in every possible way that humans can be participants in the divine nature. Grace is a participation in the divine nature, so it's not just something added on like an overcoat. It's a radical transformation of the whole of human nature so that it can be a divine human being, meaning it can exercise freedom, compassion, love. The only requirement really is to be born and to consent, to let God be in us insofar as He has given us this gift. This is a gift that has been given. There is no place to go to get it. There is no place you can go to avoid it. It just is. It's part of our very existence. And so the purpose of all the great religions is to bring us into this relationship with reality that is so intimate that no word can possibly describe it. Us to become one with Him.
Thomas Keating and I began writing together in 1976. He inspired me to enter St. Joseph's Abbey as a novice. Even after leaving the monastery, decades later, the conversation continues.
Everybody has this capacity now at this moment.
The interesting thing about Thomas is that he's become known as someone who transcends the boundaries of his own background and experience. He's had a tremendous influence, maybe more than any other Christian, in world religious dialogue.
Father Thomas Keating is one of the most well-known contemplative Christian scholars and writers, a best-selling author and well-known throughout the world.
He's a transformative figure. More than people recognize, certainly the church recognizes.
Live human life in a divine. He must have experienced God in a very, very deep way, in a totally transcendent way, and wants to share that with the world.
He's not speaking Catholic doctrine. He is using Catholic doctrine to speak universally.
Early Christian writers said there were two books of Revelation. One was the Bible, the other was nature. Well, now nature is not just looking at a sunset, it's looking at the very sources of reality itself, at the infinitesimal, and at the same time, the immense that is becoming immenser. The galaxies going in every direction. Where are they going? What was there before they came? Will it ever end expanding? These are questions that teach us something about the creative forces of nature and invite us to move humanity into areas of development and compassion that have never been possible before. I was born in New York City, and I went to a grammar school in New York. Family owned a home on Long Island where we spent most of the summers. My life was pretty much a normal life of a youngster who's being educated in a fairly well-off family. Father was a lawyer. He was very good at his profession, which happened to be admiralty law.
Here's a cartoon of him smoking a cigar. You remember those cigars?
Yes. We were brought up in a family that was not especially religious. My mother was a Bible Christian. My father was a non-practicing Catholic. I used to go to Mass sometimes before school, and because I knew my parents wouldn't approve of it, I used to slip out early in the morning before they got up, and I never told them. When I was about 5, I had some serious illness, and I can remember lying in bed, and the nurse and the doctor were in the bathroom. I realized then that they were talking about, whether I was going to make it or not. So that was an experience of death quite young. And so I didn't expect to live very long. So much so that when I made my first communion, I made a kind of agreement with God. I remember saying, if you let me live to be 21, I will become a priest. That was a serious decision for a youngster.
Cletus Keating made sure that Thomas had a fine education, first at Buckley School in New York, then at Deerfield, and at Yale.
When I was an undergraduate at Yale, a freshman in fact, I was allowed to take a course in contemporary philosophy, Nietzsche, Tolstoy, and Kierkegaard, and Kant, and Hume. Tolstoy, who was also a convert to Christianity, you might say, in his last years, wrote a remarkable commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, in which he questions whether any religion had ever pursued these values. These people challenged, especially Tolstoy, my faith that I had received as a Roman Catholic. I perceived that the practice of the Christian tradition was pretty much, as Nietzsche called it, a bourgeois Christianity. It was not the gospel that they were practicing. And so I decided I had to investigate this to resolve my conscience on whether to pursue my religious practices or not. Got all D's in my first semester.
You got D's?
Well, I wasn't studying. I was reading the mystics and the history of the church. For me, this was a matter of life and death. I knew that I had to settle this. And so I looked around in the Yale library for a book. I had no guidance. I found by happy chance a 4-volume set of the homilies of the fathers of the church, that's the first few centuries of Christianity, commenting on the 4 Gospels line by line. When I started reading this material, I was really turned on because I realized then that what I thought Christian religion should be, namely a path to contemplation, is what it was according to the early fathers. Contemplation is one of those words that has a very long history, and in general it corresponds significantly with what in the Eastern religions is called meditation. Contemplation is this growing consciousness of a relationship with the mystery of life or the ultimate reality of life that loves us and that speaks to the depths of our being and tries to draw us into some awareness of this great goodness and presence. There's several places in the gospel where Jesus specifically gives instruction about prayer. Perhaps the main one that the whole contemplative tradition is based on is Matthew 6:6, which goes like this. If you want to pray, enter your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So this is an invitation to look inwardly for the divine presence. So the basic thrust of the whole text is to shift our idea from God as utterly transcendent and far away and hard to get, and somebody whose love you have to earn, into someone who is very close, who loves you already, who you don't have to do anything to win his love, except to allow him to love you. We might say, I fell in love with this tradition and desired to become a part of it and to enter deep within it. I made a few secret visits to a monastery that I had discovered, because I knew the family was utterly opposed to my going there. It was an adventure. It was almost like a romance, but in a more profound sense than we usually think of that term. I remember when I arrived there, it was late at night, a time for the final prayers, and the priest said, well, now, take off your shoes when you go into the church, because you don't want to disturb the monks. They're always talking to God. So that was the phrase that resonated with me, because that's what I wanted to do. So that's where I fell in love with that monastery. I literally tried to be a monk from that time afterwards. So I cut out all movies, radio, opera, dating. I had something, it seems to me, was much more interesting. I remember coming out of a chapel at Yale after kneeling for about an hour there, and I just sat on the curb and said, I wish I could just die. I didn't want to go anywhere or experience anything else. It was like the end of the journey. It was that moment that I really changed completely, and my values became totally opposite to those of my beleaguered father and parents.
And did you go home and announce your newly found?
Yes.
And how was that received at Park Avenue?
It was not well received. He secretly, or maybe not so secretly to the rest of the family, was hoping I would become a lawyer in the firm of which he was the president.
There was this whole life that he was born into, which really had to do with accomplishment and leadership in the world and making money. I think he saw the futility or the mundane quality of that life and decided that it was not for him.
It was a great disappointment, I think. He certainly felt that all of the funding he put into my rather expensive education was a waste.
His parents certainly weren't going to sign him out into a monastery.
They were totally opposed, so they wouldn't give permission. At that point, I even considered leaving home. I was really sold out on this project and prepared to make any sacrifice to pursue it. The war had started and I was waiting to be drafted, which never quite happened. Thanks to the intervention of our local Monsignor.
A local Catholic priest was able to get him a spiritual deferment as if he was going into a seminary, when in fact what he really wanted to do was to go into a monastery.
I said to him, look, I have no intention of being a diocesan priest. Is it right for me to take a deferment on this basis? And he said, after some thought, this war is not meant for you. For me, this was what is called a word of wisdom. That is to say, a statement which happens to communicate a certain deep spiritual conviction. It took away my doubts.
And it cleared the way completely for him to go to the monastery. But he still felt the connection to all those people that he knew, and so every day he would pray for their safety.
So they never gave permission, but they had no choice at that point. I got to be 21. It was a pretty rocky road into the monastery because of the opposition at home.
In those days, to enter a monastery was almost to say goodbye to your son forever. You weren't assumed to have a lot of contact with him afterwards.
It was thought that the more difficult or austere life you found, the more likely you'd be to attain contemplative life. So I looked around for the hardest life I could find, and the Trappist made me an offer in the sense of their particular rules were austere enough. As soon as I entered the monastery, some of the romance disappeared, and the experience was largely one of privation and dryness. First 5 or 6 years of that life in those days was almost total silence because there were only 2 people you could talk to, the abbot and novice master, neither of whom, because of their position, are exactly in a relationship of friendship or equality, since they could throw you out at any time. February 17, 1944. Dear Dad and Mom, this is not a life of ease, nor one with long intervals for thinking, meditating, or reading. I had more time for private prayer in the world.
The life he entered in Rhode Island was really a very radical step. You couldn't have any contact with your family, you couldn't leave the monastery.
The separation was acute in the case of my grandmother, who didn't have any resources to deal with something that she considered a disaster. So she just suffered. But she wrote me a letter in which she said, I miss you so much, and I'm lying here in bed, and I say to the nurse, if my grandson won't come home, won't you please throw me out of the window? To get a letter like that on a dark, rainy day when you're already having various trials was difficult. I felt their anguish very deeply, but I felt so strongly that this was what I was supposed to do, that I couldn't change my path.
The first impulse in Christian monasticism happened right around the time of Constantine, and a lot of people fled into the deserts of Egypt and other places and formed very primitive Christian communities. And from those primitive Christian communities, the institution eventually of Christian monasticism arose with the rule of St. Benedict. But during the time of the Middle Ages, and especially afterwards in the Reformation, a lot of that knowledge was suppressed.
The contemplative life, as it was known by the Desert Fathers and Mothers, it began to disappear. And once the Reformation began, the focus was on doctrinal differences rather than on living the gospel. So it disappeared out of the teaching of the Catholic Church for several centuries.
Way back then, Thomas Keating was interested in contemplative experience. His mission was to teach John of the Cross.
I loved his poetic approach to the Bible and the spiritual journey. We're talking about something akin to human passion, motivated by a great love. Then there's his books on the dark night, which means in Spanish a night full of stars, and dark is really obscure. So knowledge of God is obscure because in this life it surpasses rational concepts. The spiritual dimension of our being is just as real as the physiological or psychological. So by meditating, one begins to access the deeper levels of interior silence. John of the Cross has a great description of silence. The eternal Father spoke only one word, and he spoke it in an eternal silence, and it is in silence that we hear it.
That knowledge bloomed in his consciousness, and he became not only an intellectual authority, but also he spent long, long hours in contemplative prayer. On March 21st, 1950, in the middle of the night, a fire raced through Our Lady of the Valley, trapping the sleeping monks inside.
Father Thomas and the other choir monks were in the least favorable position, having to come down from a third floor.
Thomas led a group of monks downstairs, someone found a ladder, and they all got out. But the monastery was destroyed. They had already decided to move to Massachusetts. The fire hastened the building of the new monastery. Right from the beginning, people realized that he took the monastic life very seriously. It wasn't very long before he was made novice master.
He always had that focus that we're here for union with God. That's what we're about. That's what the life is. That's what all life is, actually. But for him, for sure, if you came to the monastery, that's what you were here for.
So I was walking through the grove, and it was dead quiet, looking at the lovely leaves in the summertime. And all of a sudden, this breeze came up, and all these trees just burst into action, and was shaking madly like this, more than any charismatic group you've ever seen. And I had the feeling, this is a standing ovation. They felt like I was being greeted by all these wonderful leaves, and it wasn't just a few, but the whole place was just exploding, leaves and branches in glee. And then, fortunately, some degree of humility resurrected in me. I said, they're not waving at me, they're waving at God in me. So I waved back to God in them.
In 1958, Thomas was appointed superior of St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado.
The first group of monks came in the winter of '56. It was a ranch at that time. We had about 500 or 600 head of cattle.
Only 3 years later, while still superior at St. Benedict's, Thomas was elected abbot for life at St. Joseph's Abbey and was called back to Spencer, Massachusetts.
Father Joachim, who was the runner-up at that time, was very nervous, and everybody thought it was him. But an older brother told me, he says, no, Thomas got it. So get ready. There's going to be a strict way of life now.
He was very, very strict when he became abbot.
In those days, austerity was a big piece of how he saw that journey into God.
Was he very much that way in those days?
Oh, he lived it. Let me tell you, he lived it. And he had a bearing that carried it.
He wouldn't hesitate to tell somebody that they did not have a vocation if they were not able to spend their time well. That gave Thomas the indication that you're not happy with just being at peace in a quiet setting. So he was strict. And a lot of people left, and I know that he told a number of people that they did not have vocations.
It was quite an exodus for the first 6-7 months. And that's when I got to know Tom Keating. I confronted him. I said, "Who do you think you are coming in here, disturbing this beautiful place, and getting rid of all these guys?" And naturally he responded and he said, "Well, I don't know how you got that idea that they all had vocations." That's how we got our dual relationship, dual in the fact that we were combating at different times.
There was a lot of conflict.
This was unusual in the Trappist order at that time.
It was very unusual.
No sooner had Thomas been elected abbot than a wave of change swept through the Catholic Church. Pope John XXIII called a Vatican Council to reevaluate every aspect of the Church, including the monastic orders, many of which had not changed since the Middle Ages.
It was a time of experiment and more change in a few years than had taken place in many centuries.
These two dynamics in the world, in the church and in the monastery, were facing each other, and he was right in the middle of it.
I was battered and beaten and fully conscious of being a total failure in this area because there was no way you could win. Whatever decision you made would disaffect half of the community. So it was excruciating.
So he told me that when he was going to these conclaves in Rome, they arranged an outing.
We were exhausted and frustrated and desperate and not agreed. A few of us took a day off and decided to visit Anzio Beach and then the cemetery, which is beautifully laid out.
Anzio was a scene of a lot of battles in World War II. And so there was a large number of Allied casualties.
I walked into this cemetery and saw the graves with the cross and a Star of David and so on. I was sort of suddenly surrounded by this sense of great welcome and friendship. And it was as if these guys who were my contemporaries were saying, well, here's the guy who prayed for us while we were going up the Po Valley to be shot to pieces. So I have felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude coming from nothing visible, just a sense of being surrounded by great love. I was so moved, I couldn't, I had to move off from the others who were there because they didn't want to explain it. And so then the words of the Monsignor came back to me, saying that this war, World War II, is not meant for you. And so it was as if I heard these young men saying, he needs our help for what I was going through. I had the sense that they would pray for me now as I tried to deal with situations that were psychologically, I won't say hellish, but close. Well, I certainly regarded myself as a lousy abbot, that's for sure. But that God doesn't seem to care too much about that detail. If he wants you to do something, it doesn't seem to matter who the hell you are. So he chooses the least likely or the worst candidates, I guess, maybe just to exercise his ingenuity a little bit.
In the late 60s and early 70s, Thomas began to be more open to contemplative life, not just in Christianity, but in religious traditions all over the world.
He had come through the difficulties of the Trappist life, and I think he had come into a new awareness with his meditation.
I've heard people say that there was an earlier Thomas and a later Thomas. He was abbot at 20 years, and basically the first 10 years he was a different person.
Everybody knows he changed 180 degrees.
Thomas made some sort of sensitivity workshop at one point.
After which he returned a changed person.
And that was a huge breakthrough for him, getting away from the strict observance, Trappist mentality, into understanding more, I think, of compassion.
Well, when we speak of the journey, really, this is another word for process, or another word for growth. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that the gospel is chiefly designed to encourage us to grow and to keep growing into divine union and even unity, so that in John's gospel, that concept of growth seems to go on into almost endless and unlimited possibilities. Having read the Fathers of the Church, I was tuned into the idea that everything in Scripture has a spiritual meaning. And so it's only a step from there to realize that everything created is a stepping stone to the Creator, that God is hiding behind things, but is present at the same time. We now know from quantum mechanics and all the other sciences that everything is interrelated and interconnected, and everything came out of a trillionth of a millimeter of energy and is still expanding. So I love the idea that it's the spiritual creative activity that is the source of matter, not some building block. As Taryaj puts it, Christ is present in every particle. In the prologue to St. John, he speaks of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Since the Word is a vibration, we could think of the ultimate constituency of matter is vibration. And so the Word of God is a vibration that brings everything else into vibration. It's like a dove cooing. Is there a distinction? Yes, but can they be separated? No. No dove, no cooing. And so all our actions depend, our cooing, on the dove. This is, I think, is what Eckhart means by the grunt, or the ground in which everything is emerging at every moment. And maybe that's especially meaningful for me because I once had an experience of everything emerging out of the ground. I was recovering from some operation. I think it was a hernia operation. I happened to take take a little walk in the evening. I stepped out of this infirmary building at Spencer onto the tarmac there, and without knowing how or why, I was surrounded and penetrated by an incredible love that was absolutely respectful, humble, powerful, immense, penetrating. And so I had some touches of being loved by God, but this was overwhelming. And I just happened to look up, and there was a full moon. And I realized that God had made the moon just for that night, so that I could celebrate in a kind of romantic way this revelation of his love for me. So I also had the impression that God was slightly amused at my surprise. And as I walked down a little way, this tree suddenly illuminated, and my whole life went by on the branches of that tree in about 5 seconds. And everything seemed to be okay, and the sense that nothing matters except this. And so I walked into the field there behind the guest house, and the hay that was coming up and the trees that were coming up and the air or the heat, everything was emerging out of God, including me. So I was in such jubilee at this point that I started jumping up and down, something I didn't normally do. And that lasted, I guess, about an hour. But it was all I can say is, this is reality, and nothing else that I ever could do or did do is meaningful compared to this. So it was not a question of reward at all, or of approval. It was just the way things are. In other words, this is the destiny not just of individual, exceptional human beings, but is what the whole family of humans is moving to.
Thomas had just come into this fascination with consciousness, I would call it. He had an amazing group of people that would be coming and going at the monastery at that time. People like the Dalai Lama, Swami Satchidananda, Joshu Sasaki, all sorts of interesting characters. So life was fascinating.
While I was coming as a candidate, the monks were watching Maharishi, Science of Creative Intelligence. So I went there and I was initiated into TM. What transcendental meditation opened up to me was a taste of silence that I'd never experienced before.
Basil Pennington and William Menninger and Thomas were experiencing methods of meditation, understanding them as having once been very central to the Christian experience.
We had been practicing this in our own way in the monastery for a number of years. So it was a question of translating the essence of that practice into a form that would be accessible.
So out of his own contemplative Christian experience arose this very simple method called centering prayer, which he developed along with William Menninger and Basil Pennington.
And so I invite you now to close your eyes as the symbol of letting go of your own concerns for these 20 minutes. Surely God can take care of you and the world at least for 20 minutes without your thinking about it. Centering prayer addresses a very deep need in human nature. Apart from its religious aspects, everybody needs some time to be with themselves, just to be themselves. They need some time to reflect, some time to be quiet, some time to be free of the pressure of thoughts, especially oppressive thoughts, anxieties, worrisome thoughts. The centering prayer period is like taking a little vacation from ourselves and our concerns. We don't even think about God. We choose a symbol, which can be a word or the breath, perhaps an inward glance towards this presence, not with an image or a picture, but simply a gesture of our will turning towards God. It's this gesture that simply reminds our cluttered mind and our disordered habits of thinking to be able to rest, at least with a certain increasing habitual character, in the presence of that which just is. We've been culturally conditioned to imagine God as transcendent, which he is, but at the same time, he's infinitely immanent. So the slightest movement towards this presence simply activates a presence that already exists. And it's this turning to God that is really the chief act in contemplative prayer, receiving and allowing the divine love to flow into us. Basically, the gesture of sitting down after a few months' practice is itself all you need to do to establish your intention to enter the spiritual level of your being and consent to God's presence and action there. And this presence and action, unquestionably, is like therapy. Centering prayer deals with the same area of the deepest kind of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis that we know of, only it goes much deeper. It's an exposure of our inmost being and the contents unknown to us of our unconscious that we're opening to God and to our deep self for processing. So in the course of this therapy, there are some significant moments when very deep trauma are reaffirmed into our consciousness as the way the body has of evacuating this material, which is secretly influencing our judgment.
I started practicing centering prayer at sort of the absolute low tide spiritually of my life. And everything good that has happened in my life since then has come out of centering prayer. Good to see you again. But the difference that you made in my life is that you actually showed me how to do it. Okay, you gave me the steps, even I could understand it and figure it out, okay?
I see, thank God.
Yes, thank God. I started in January of 2000 at Wallens Ridge, which was a supermax prison. I spent 2 of those 14 years convinced, because my lawyers were telling me so, that I would be executed.
Jens is so completely changed that this is not the same guy that went into jail.
Through centering prayer, I've really come to understand that God is constantly creating opportunities. Yeah. And the great trick to life is to be there and to listen. And for me, centering prayer got me to pay attention long enough to where God could show me how I could use my situation in here to help other prisoners through my writings. We do it for 40 minutes, for about 40 minutes, we've been out of prison. We've been free, we've left.
What has amazed me is how relentless the divine action is. It's dealing with an enormous intelligence who knows us through and still loves us infinitely and is not put off by our mistakes or faults, but is always arranging everything so that we have to forgive everybody. But the hardest person, of course, is ourselves. The gift of God is absolutely gratuitous. It's not something you earn. It's something that's there, and something you just have to accept. And that's why the essence of centering prayer as a way to access the divine presence is essentially simply consent to a presence that is already here in our hearts and in everyone else's heart and through all creation. And its action, and the action is motivated by a love that is unconditional and unlimited. Any human development is also a spiritual development, because the psychology of human beings is about spirituality, actually. It's becoming fully human and evolving. Bringing this into daily life begins to change the way we perceive everyday life. We begin to see it with a perspective that is broader and more compassionate. We begin to see people at a deeper level than their persona, see the presence of God in them and compassion for their struggles.
I was having this conversation with Thomas. I said, do you consider this Christian monastic path a viable spiritual path? Has it advanced you spiritually in your life? And if so, can you tell me one example where it did that? And he thought for a long time, and he told me the story about his father. With operating funds running low at St. Benedict's, the abbot called Thomas back to Spencer to explain that he decided to close the monastery. It was suggested that Thomas fly to New York to try to raise enough money to finish construction. The abbot gave Thomas a week. He said, you go down and talk to your father and see if there's anybody in New York in that circle of affluent Catholic families that can support your foundation. And I'm sure it was a reluctant journey on Thomas's part.
So I went to the old man and I said, this is what's happened. Well, he said spontaneously, I'll donate to the cause $10,000. Okay. So then he suggested a couple of other people I could see. So I touched them for a little bit here and there. Then I back to him and said, I don't think it's enough. He gave us another 10,000. That his gift actually enabled that monastery to exist. What he most not wanted to do originally, he came around to support in a way that was crucial. And so it also enabled me to see other aspects of them, and also at the same time as my own purification continues, I saw that I had never fully forgiven him. At some level, I was still at odds with him, and some traces in the unconscious were not completely. So his mellowing affected me. It was only later on when I perceived in deeper levels my own failure to forgive or to be concerned even for his feelings. I was thinking of the pain that I had and the fact that he should change, that he was not acting according to the Christian script, so to speak. It was an insight for me into the reason why forgiveness is at the very center of Christianity. This is enormous freedom that only occurred after he had died. So it's something I could never tell him. There are two contributions from the world of contemporary psychology that are crucial, and one is the personal unconscious, and the second one is the collective unconscious. And by unconscious we mean something that is truly present somewhere in our psyche and warehoused in the body so that it's for real, that we don't recognize or know about, and in many cases don't want to know about. Especially is this the case with regard to what Jung calls, and which has been developed in other psychological systems, as the shadow. The shadow is the dark side of our personality, or that about ourselves that we most dislike. Without knowing what that is and coming to terms with it, it is so painful and distressful that most people will project it on other people and hate in them what it is painful to hate in oneself.
As the centering prayer movement grew, so did Thomas's reputation. By the late 70s, his interest in world religious dialogue, science, and spirituality began to create serious tension within the monastery.
All those years, he had been very conscientious, an excellent monk. He was the abbot, and he certainly knew the traditional Cistercian monasticism, and yet, for some reason, the Holy Spirit had done something a little different with him.
He was a breakthrough. Thomas Keating completely turned the whole Trappist orientation from asceticism to contemplation.
Did he have the support of his community in doing this, or was there a lot of resistance?
Both were there in all degrees of the spectrum, in every individual.
There's this kind of rubber band between where he was and where a lot of the people were in the monastery that couldn't move as fast. They were happy where they were in a more traditional mindset. He went through a rough period where he had to be very careful about the kinds of things he said.
Thomas was getting tired. He had been abbot probably 15 years, and it was clearly weighing on him.
He was relating a dream. It had something to do with hanging wallpaper, and it just wouldn't stay up there. He was trying to get it to stay up. And he started crying because he was using that image of his efforts as an abbot in serving the community. I've never forgotten it.
Thomas was acutely aware that the monastery was deeply divided. Exhausted and undecided, he spoke with his superior during a regular visitation. The superior suggested a straw vote. 6 months later, the vote was taken, and it was evenly split. Many were shocked, but Thomas, out of love for the community, resigned, declined to stand for re-election, and left the monastery almost immediately.
That was sort of traumatic because he's the only abbot I knew. I revered him as a wisdom figure, as a real spiritual master. And all of a sudden, he's not here.
Nearing his end, he invited me up to see his apartment in the Abbot's Tower. He wanted to thank me for helping him grow. He said, "I was mean to you." And I said I was mean to you, so it really loosened a lot of bullshit, you know.
So there's a lot of mutual forgiveness.
Yeah.
Sometimes when people leave our lives, we get to see more clearly their gifts to us. What were his gifts to you?
I got his affirmation. I know that he loves me. And yeah, that's very, very dear.
As life goes on, you realize that God is using you as a vessel just to love everyone, not to distinguish. And when you experience that love going through you, you realize that a lot of that came from the gifts that Thomas helped to cultivate. And you're very happy. You're very happy. It's wonderful. Thomas is genuinely loved here by everyone.
I know that it was extremely difficult for him when he left Spencer. The pain of that was enormous.
So leaving was a kind of death for him.
Exactly. You almost have to go through the death experience to experience the resurrection and become very, very fruitful, because there's no question his writings are touching a lot of people. And there's an awful lot of pain out there. So when they hear him, they know that that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the life experience of pain, suffering, and resurrection.
In the Christian tradition, the teaching of baptism is so central to our understanding of the mystery of Christ. Baptism is a commitment to the death of the false self. The baptismal pool is a symbol of descending into the purifying waters. And out of that descent into the pool, of course, comes the rising out of the pool, which is the resurrection of Christ's life in us that manifests itself through those fruits and gifts: joy, selfless love, peace, a peace that is beyond understanding.
In late 1981, Thomas returned to Snowmass, which over the years had become his spiritual home.
Some friends offered to let me stay at their house as a place of retreat and rest and discernment. And sometimes the solitude was intense. Might be compared to being in a nest up here with this incredible beauty in front of you, somewhat like an eagle. They like solitude too, I understand.
In 1984, Thomas co-founded Contemplative Outreach, which became a platform for making center and prayer accessible to a worldwide audience.
Knowing what this was, I knew that it could be available to people living ordinary lives. The whole orientation of my monastic life shifted to trying to share this with people who were beginning to feel a great hunger and thirst for a deeper meaning in life or experience of God.
I went on retreat with him in 1983. I went up to that mountain as Carl the priest. I came off that mountain as Carl the human being who happens to be a priest.
You're surrounded by great love.
I came in October of 1986. Within the first 2 hours of his beginning to speak, I knew that this man was going to open up to me the riches of the Christian journey, and that somehow it was going to fit with what I had already been doing for 11 years. It wasn't an intellectual understanding, it just was an understanding.
Within 2 sentences, he brought all my Eastern experience and my Catholic upbringing together all at once. And I recognized him as my teacher. And it was almost not so much about what he said, but just about who he is and his presence. And he just could bring it together in such a way that meant something to me very, very deeply within me. Something really resonated.
I had asked him about praying with breath, you know, breathing in God and breathing out sin. And he said to me, breathing in God is good. Why don't you breathe out love? And that was sort of an aha moment, which has, you know, it stayed with me, and it's a prayer that I continue. Very simple, but very meaningful and life-changing.
I think pretty much all of us recognize that this was a very big thing happening and something that had the potential for a lot of good in the world.
He wasn't looking necessarily a contemplative outreach and looking for a larger audience or ministry throughout the world, but that's what happened.
It took off. It wasn't what we expected when he came. I don't think it's what he expected when he came, but it took off and just became a whirlwind.
He was really responding to the Spirit and was enabled to, because he was no longer an abbot. He said that after being abbot for 20 years, he felt being abbot was being in a cage. Now all of a sudden the cage is gone.
And he's free.
And he's free.
Our project is not just to become a better human being, as desirable as that would be for our friends and relatives, but it's to become a divine human being, or to learn how to live human life in a divine way, or with the dispositions or attitudes of divine wisdom, divine love, and the other aspects of the divinity that are reflected in the human organism. This is what religion's job is. The project is the transformation of individuals and, at some point, the whole human family. Perhaps for the first time in human history, the various religions are now experiencing each other at a deeper levels of communication and discovering a communion in the search. God is manifesting himself in all the religions in some way and in different ways.
Yes.
And so we can transcend the intensity of the different interpretations by the experience of the oneness that comes through contemplative prayer.
Indeed. In fact, what I have found with my students is that when their experience of their religion is founded and anchored on the experience of God, it transcends all difference and embraces all difference.
That's beautiful.
Beyond religion means not relying on religious faith, but actually basis of all major religious tradition: love, compassion, forgiveness. So that's the universal value. The Creator himself, infinite compassion, infinite love.
Everything is a manifestation of the source, and that source is inviting all beings into the very life of God, into the happiness, into the compassion. And it's out of that level of human experience that one can live ordinary daily life as in the womb of God. We're growing up in God, and evolution is the birth canal into divine life itself.
Tell me what Thomas Keating, the human being, is really like.
Well, first of all, he's the real thing. He's a very humble person that lives exactly what he's talking about and doesn't say a word that isn't true for himself first.
He's a person who has a reputation of being holy and impressive. Well, he's all those things, but they're minor compared to his genuineness.
At this point, I don't regard myself as knowing anything. I make many mistakes, and I'm getting happier in making them. And I'm not sure that process ever ceases. In some respects, I feel I'm just beginning, or I'd be willing to start over again. But on the other hand, I wouldn't change anything either.
If you think of Thomas's life, you know, born to a Long Island lawyer, let go of that, on to Deerfield Academy, let go of that, on to college, let go of that, went to the Valley burned down, let go of that, came to Spencer, was a novice master and lay brother master, let go of that, elected Superior in Colorado, let go of that, came to Spencer, became abbot of Spencer, let go of that. And that's only one level of letting go. I mean, Thomas would tell you that's the physical level and the intellectual level, but if we consent to the silence and let go into the silence, it makes all the difference in the world.
Silence is God's language, at least his first language. I would say if you just keep quiet, you find this out. There's something about silence that is so accessible to what God is that you begin to pick up by osmosis God's attitudes. We're dealing with an infinite intelligence that is totally penetrated by a love that is perhaps inconceivable to us. And it's in coming to understand the stages of this love that are available to human beings that is the work of contemplation. It's not just a method of prayer. In fact, it goes beyond all methods. It's a relationship. Hence, it has a spontaneity that begins perhaps first in prayer for most people, and then begins to weave its way into all kinds of activity, even the most trivial. And one begins to see that God is in everything and perceive the goodness of everything for that very reason. And as this forms as habit, you feel a deeper silence that might be called spaciousness. There's nothing in it except a certain vibrancy and aliveness. You're awake, but to wake to what? You don't know, but you're awake to something that is absolutely marvelous and totally generous, and that manifests itself with increasing tenderness and sweetness and intimacy, so that it's as if one feels embraced by God interiorly, or kissed, or held. The divine grace awakens us so that we're looking at life, you might say, from the perspective of divine wisdom, or from God's point of view. It's accepting reality just as it is, although these flowers, these stones, your foolish questions, the sky, the water, everything in nature, everything in human relationships, actually is God in a certain sense, manifesting his goodness in infinite number of ways. God is prepared to share himself with us beyond anything we can know. So it's a happiness that is inconceivable that we're being invited into. And the only condition is to consent, to say yes.